Welcome to Week 6. The modern movement hits the good old USA. My favorite image representing early in the era of modernist art in 1939, there was a World's Fair located in Queens, New York. You can still see these sculptural objects, the Trilon and the Perisphere there. They also featured in Men in Black, if you remember that. So modernism movements crossed the Atlantic early on, but were not initially embraced in the USA. The 1913 Armory Show, if you can remember, introduced modernism to America and generated a storm of protest and public rejection of modern art and design. When modernism in design crossed the pond, it received much the same reaction. Editors and writers attacked John Tischhold's elementary typography as typographic fireworks, a typic revolution of insane jugglings of type by a band of crazy foreign type anarchists. A small number of American typographers and designers recognized the value of these new ideas, and it started to slowly gain ground in book design, editorial design for fashion and business magazines, promotional graphics, and corporate graphics. But then there was a brief interruption of about 10 years when the adoption of the avant-garde aesthetic was interrupted by the economic collapse of the Great Depression. So since all economic activity pretty much ceased, so did these expensive and tied to economic activity experiments in design. With a little help from the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, the Works Progress Administration, art did commence throughout the Depression. The Works Progress Administration created something called the Federal Art Project, which provided job opportunities for unemployed artists, including actors, musicians, visual artists, writers, and graphic designers, to continue their professional careers. That was in 1935. Some of the works that are left are valuable documents from this time that show a bird's eye view of what was going on in America. So this is 1936, a photograph for the Farm Security Administration from a photographer named Walker Evans. And I think it's interesting here to see these decaying homes next to Depression-era movie posters that really documents the gap between reality and a graphic fantasy that people, were kind of indulging in these escapist movies and books to deal with the reality around them. This was photographed in Atlanta. And you can also see here's a little window on billboards of the time that were dominated by traditional illustration, nothing exciting or, really avant-garde going on there. The same photographer, Walker Evans, partnered with the writer James Agee and eventually produced this book, which grew out of a magazine assignment that was never published during this time. They spent 30 days with 3 different desperately poor sharecropper families in Alabama and documented their lives with photojournalism and a new form of writing called literary nonfiction. To produce this new form of book, I guess we would call it a coffee table book today. It was full of big photographs and essays about the people. And several of those photographs have become iconic representations of the period, including this portrait of a farm wife. So the WPA created, as part of its work, a poster project. 35,000 posters were designed and silkscreen printed as part of the project, and they included all kinds of topics from cultural events to travel destinations, and all sponsored by the government. You can see in these that the artists were working from all kinds of inspirations, from Bauhaus to back to pictorial modernism, some constructivist ideas, and they were new experiments that contrasted with the traditional illustration that dominated American graphic communication during this time. So the topics included theatrical performances, art exhibitions, and public service communications about health or crime prevention, housing, education. Produced over 2 million copies of the 35,000 different designs. And it's interesting that some of the posters were for theatrical exhibitions because the WPA art project also included actors and musicians. This is an index of an exhibition of all of the posters. I love this one. Objects reduced to their simplest graphic forms. The Federal Art Project employed more than 5,000 artists in various projects, including the many poster divisions across the United States. This one was a reminder to get your eyes examined. Visit the aquarium. Many New Deal administrators believed that art could be part of the daily lives of all Americans, not just the elite, and could enrich the lives of anyone who came in contact with it. So the employment of out-of-work artists was not the only goal. They also believed that exposing everyday Americans to education, research, and exhibitions and community art centers would be beneficial to everyone. This is a signed poster by Catherine Milhouse. This is also by Catherine Milhouse, urging people to visit where we live and look at the geometric sans serif type design at the bottom. One of the artists working for the WPA was Lester Beall, probably unrecognized a little bit during his lifetime, but an avant-garde, forward-thinking designer who very much understood Jan Tischol's new typography and also all the various art movements, including the Dada movement's random organization of intuitive placement of elements and chants. He was primarily self-taught in graphic design, but had great knowledge and understanding of the European avant-garde. And you'll see the influence of constructivist and Bauhaus energy mixed with his personal artistic sense. So these are some of his posters for the Rural Electrification Administration of 1937, advertising the benefits of these basic services that were being provided to rural areas that had not had running water or electrical hookup. And the key here was that the audiences, at least part of the audiences in these areas were illiterate, couldn't read. So being able to communicate the benefit of electricity presented through signs that were understandable to anyone. Another one of his posters for the Rural Electrification Administration. You can see these patriotic colors and happy farm children implying a rural life that's improved by these government programs. He experimented a lot with different planes of flat color, photomontage, and overprinting, combining photography, graphics, and typography into concise messages about the benefits of electricity. During the 1950s and 60s, after the Depression, he got more work and was very active as a designer for corporations. These posters are now just iconic representations of early modernist works in the United States. Another early modernist was William Addison Dwiggins. He signed his work W.A.D. He's probably most famous for us as the coiner of the term graphic design. He was quite a character who wrote and designed extensively, and as seen in these pictures, also had a passion for marionettes, including this little mini-me marionette that looks just like him. I first learned about him because he is associated with my hometown. I think he might have been born in Indiana. This is the title page spread of a book in 1936 called The Power of Print and Men, produced by the Mergenthaler Linotype Company, so it was really a promotion for typography. And Dwiggins himself designed the typefaces Metro and Electra. He had a passion for subtle color combinations. This is not just a black and white version of a color piece. This is the subtle grays that he was playing with. And you can see this uncommon title page arrangements and this interesting little cubist collage made out of traditional type ornaments on the left-hand side. Designed many book covers, a lot of editorial, a lot of corporate design. This is a beautiful cover for the book, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. And you can see again there the influence of modernist ideas, including futurism and cubism, down at the bottom with these geometric shapes. Quite vocal about his opinions about new layout and design theories. So he was, again, the first to name this business that he was in, graphic design, and produced this book called Layout and Advertising. A new revised edition of the standard work on all phases of advertising, layout, and design by a modern master of the graphic arts. And I like this little freeform, again, illustration using abstract elements at the bottom. A beautiful logo type initial cap, letter W, again, created out of printer's ornaments. Here is one of his typefaces. This is the one Metro. He designed this after writing a scathing review of some European sans serif type fonts. It was like, oh yeah? Well, then you think you can do better? Design your own sans serif. So he did. He designed, in the end, 18 different typefaces for Mergenthaler Corporation. During the 1930s and 40s, in the height of the Depression and then the war years that followed, there was a movement in fashion and in film to this kind of escapism with a glamour defined by the new Hollywood, talking pictures and eventually color movies, and the influence of European fashion designers like Chanel and Schiaparelli, the influx of new fabrics, including polyester and rayon, an exploration of trying to design with a frugal use of fabric, including bias cuts, a new emphasis on accessories and grooming. At the time, it's important to remember, while images like this were presented on screen and in fashion magazines, most American women maybe owned one good dress and one or two daytime dresses. So a way to sort of gussy yourself up would be to style your hair differently or wear makeup. Merle Armitage was a Californian designer. This is a portrait of him by the photographer Edward Weston, who he frequently collaborated with. He lived primarily in Southern California from 1923 until his death in 1975. He was the first in the lineage of designers of a certain ilk that rejected tradition, forged their own path, and did it their way. They set out to invent the new, and in doing so rejected East Coast traditions, European conventions, or any kind of sacred schools of art or design, be it traditional or modern. It's an attitude particularly endemic to California. And he was quite the impresario, working on everything from producing movies and magazines and books, publishing them, writing them, and designing them. This is the title page of a book about Martha Graham from 1935, The Dancer, very innovative use of typography. His type ranged from Renaissance-inspired designs to books for avant-garde music. He helped define the modernist design aesthetic in the United States. And you can see here sans serif capital letters spaced and separated by hairline rules. And this kind of sans serif spread out, all caps, letter-spaced type, I think of as being particularly Californian, which is kind of crazy. This is another spread from the book about Martha Graham. You can see how each page in this book and in a lot of his work was an experiment in using some of the European ideas, but with his own Californian twist and a lot of wonderful photography. And his work took a conceptual and rebellious left turn from other work of the time. These are 6 title spreads, so the very idea of doing 6 title pages instead of just one, from a book called Dynamic Dissonance in Nature and the Arts from 1952, designed by him. I love this simple little ad from 1923. It's an ad for a performance by Rosa Poncell. He also designed movie titles and was very interested in the new technology of moving pictures, especially in combination with design and fine art. Armitage was an influence on later California designers, from Alvin Lustig to Walt Disney, all the way to April Greiman, who we will find in future lectures. So those were some Americans that were working on their own to incorporate the new ideas of modern graphic design. But we can't underestimate the huge influence of those who fled from foreign shores to flee the fascist regimes in Italy and Germany, and when it was invaded in France. The rise of Nazism in Europe created one of the greatest transnational migrations of talent in history. I think we primarily think of that as in scientists and maybe authors, but also architects, artists, and designers left Europe for the safety of the United States, either ahead of the war in the 1930s or during the war, including the designers of the Bauhaus, who formed the new Bauhaus American School of Design in Chicago. This is a wonderful snapshot of the time. A huge development of American graphic design resulted from the Bauhaus closing in 1933 and the migration of all kinds of European cultural innovators who fled, including the Bauhaus faculty, students, and alumni that dispersed throughout the world, but mostly in the United States, making modern design a truly international movement. You could chart all of the relationships between different designers and their schools in a huge, spreadsheet that would involve all kinds of diagonal lines connecting people. But some of the important immigrants to America in the fields of graphic design are Erté, who was born Roman de Chertoff, Dr. Mehmed Femi Aga, Alexey Brodovitch, Alexander Lieberman, Martin Munkazi, and C.P. Pinellas. They were all part of this design diaspora, including these 4 Russian-born, French-educated immigrants, Erté, Aga, Brodovitch, and Lieberman, who brought European modernism to American design, and Munkazi, who was a Hungarian photographer, and C.P. Pinellas, who was a Ukrainian fine artist originally. They helped to found, during the height of the Depression and the pre-war era before World War II, was really a boom time as Americans took refuge in glamorous images in magazines that were heavily influenced by European ideas. I love this photograph of the artist Erté, who is a major proponent of Art Deco, carrying those ideas from France to the United States. He designed covers and fashion illustrations for the magazine Harper's Bazaar, and combined the stylized drawing of synthetic cubism, exotic decoration, and the elegance of high fashion into his own particular, beautifully illuminated Art Deco. This is a cover from July of 1929. And you can see it again here. There was more of a reliance early on in illustration than in photography. We'll get to that later. And interestingly, no standardization of the masthead, with these fun and very graphic and geometric Art Decoed characters. This may remind you again of certain European designers like A.M. Cassandra. Erté also famous for limited editions of lithographs. When someone says Art Deco, this is what I think of, is the designs of Erté. In his fashion illustration, he also was really designing his own clothes. He also did costume and theatrical design, and just hundreds of these Art Deco women. Notice the wonderful accompanying typographic invention, little signature on the upper left there. This was the costume design for the character Diamond in the Folies Bergère in Paris. And he also designed for Irving Berlin's Music Box Review in New York in 1924. This is a costume design for The Marriage of Figaro. Another Russian-born, French-educated designer, Dr. Mehmed Fehmi Aga. He was born in Russia, was Turkish in ethnicity, and then educated in France, and then fled to America. He was a designer and art director and a pioneer of modern American publishing, instrumental in defining the role of the magazine art director and delivering the full force of European avant-garde experimentation to the pages of magazines like Vogue, Vanity Fair, and House and Garden. These were all flagship magazines of the Condé Nast Publishing Company, which of course is still publishing in the United States. He was the art director of Vogue and later Vanity Fair and House and Garden, and introduced full bleed photography, machine set type, and asymmetrical layouts to these American magazines. Wonderful cover of Vogue from early on. And again, the non-standardization of the masthead is interesting until they arrived at the current style that we know. Again, moving from illustration to a full bleed photography and color. You can see here the color reproduction was a little crude at the beginning. This is Martin Munkazi at work with his box camera standing in a pool. He was one of a new breed of editorial and advertising photographers that could use those box cameras like the one that he's holding, a 35 millimeter, which was called a miniature camera, as opposed to a large camera that required a tripod and a huge stand. So this made him much more flexible and able to, capture unusual angles, go out on location, and put himself into the picture, so to speak. He rejected the conventions of the studio and allowed outside locations and natural movements of his models, as reflected in work like this. This is an editorial spread called The Last Warm Rays of Sunshine in Autumn, which was in 1929, I think. Portrait of a Broadway performer, Rosie Barsoni. Another immigrant to our shores was C.P. Pinellas. She was born of Jewish parents in Vienna, Austria, and grew up in Poland. Her family emigrated to New York in 1923, thank God. She studied commercial art at the Pratt Institute of Art and worked in textile design and then became a magazine art director and then graphic designer. I love this view of her with, her modern work, but a distinctly old-fashioned European hairdo. Her first design job was for the Association of European and American Designers, where she was exposed to textile design and women's fashion from Europe. And then she became an assistant to Dr. Aga at Vogue in the 1930s, who gave her a chance. Very unusual to hire a young woman in the 1930s. You can see her work on these Vogue covers, similar to his with that pose of the woman in the V shape. She started to commission illustrations for these magazines from fine artists, and her imagery was often very different than other conventional magazines at the time, which, of course, being ahead of the curve, being modern, being all about what's new and what's next, is the essence of editorial fashion design, since fashion itself depends on convincing people to buy new things all the time. She made a major contribution to editorial design during the 1940s and 50s at Vogue, Glamour, 17, Charm, and Mademoiselle, all new magazines that were aimed at women readers. Again, this is during the time of Rosie the Riveter. The men are at war and the women are at home with their few pennies of spare change made from working on their own, buying a magazine for maybe 50 cents or a quarter. This issue of Charm in January of 1954 was still only 25 cents. Charm magazine was the first magazine that was designed for working women, a new idea still at the time. She was the first woman admitted to the New York Art Directors Club. And for this magazine, she was quoted as saying, "You might say that we tried to convey the attractiveness of reality as opposed to the glitter of a Never Never Land." Another cover image from July of 1949, the stripe patterns and a mirror image bring a visual interest to the photograph, drawing the viewer into the design. Her publication designs were characterized by a new appreciation of color, pattern, and form. In 1965, she was appointed the design consultant to the Lincoln Center for the Arts, which was a very prestigious role in which her responsibilities included the design of posters, programs, and the overall graphic identity of the Lincoln Center in New York City. She began teaching also in 1959, around the time that she left the magazine world. This is for the Lincoln Center Festival Journal. Another image from her Charm magazine covers. She was a longtime teacher at the Parsons School of Design. So many of these early modernists also moved into not only publishing works about their design theories, practicing design, but also teaching design, which influenced later art directors and designers. This is another important badass woman in editorial design, Carmel Snow, who was editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar in New York from 1934 to 1958. She championed the concept of the well-dressed woman with the well-dressed mind and broadened the scope of fashion journalism to encompass art, fiction, and photography. Her contemporaries called her the greatest fashion editor ever. Here she is in conversation with Diana Vreeland, who became the editor of Vogue. Here is her wonderful protege, Alexey Brodovitch. He came to the United States in 1930 to start teaching, to start as school, like to make the school, not to start as a student. And he trained students there in the fundamentals of European design. So he's practicing as a designer in Europe. And there he is later in his life. He was widely respected and known as a teacher. Apparently, he was a real tough teacher. He did wonderful covers and interior design for the magazine Harper's Bazaar from 1939 to 1947, again hired by the editor-in-chief Carmel Snow in 1934. He played a crucial role in introducing into the United States a radically simplified modern graphic design style that was forged in Europe in the 1920s from all those different vanguard movements, the isms that we talked about in week 4. This is Alexey Brodovitch looking at the entire spread of Harper's Bazaar laid out, the entire magazine laid out on the floor of his office. I love this image. It reassures me because it's not only me that needs to look at the whole thing physically printed out, one page after another. I know sometimes web designers still look at their projects this way. We were visiting the offices of National Geographic a few years ago, and they have this amazing conference room that has a little rail all the way around all 3 sides of the room so that you can lay out the whole magazine in printed proofs and walk around the walls of the room to see the spreads of the magazine in sequence. He took an active role in conceiving and commissioning all kinds of forms of graphic art, as you saw, from illustration to photography, and specialized in discovering and showcasing young and unknown talent. Allegedly, the film Funny Face that starred Fred Astaire as the art director, whose name was Dovich, was based on him. He was instrumental in making photography the backbone of modern magazine design, and his first assistant in New York was a young Irving Penn, who was also discovered by him. In addition, he discovered or promoted the photographers Richard Avedon, Hero, Leslie Grill, Art Kane, and Diane Arbus, major photographers of the 20th century. This, again, I wonder if they did this maybe in camera. Probably what they did. Here's a sort of radically shocking magazine design. I always think that people now working in editorial design are constantly trying to think of new ways to arrange type and photo, and you really can't beat this. And no, it's not a distorted image of the page. He actually printed that photo on the left in the darkroom as a distorted, stretched out view. Another diagonally inspired composition. You've got this wonderful combination of a brilliant young art director working with an innovative photographer in Irving Penn. Combination is pure magic. Here we have Alexey Brodovitch working with the photographer Man Ray. Not only was he working in editorial in Harper's Bazaar, but for other magazines, including this new graphic design magazine called Portfolio. As color photography became more possible, utilizing that. This is an interior spread from Harper's. Again, these dramatic shapes and compositions. And over time, there's just dozens and dozens of wonderful covers. Illustration, this is very European, 1930s. Look at the cropping, though, about this. I mean, who does that? So great. 60 cents in 1948. So it would have been a big indulgence to spend that on yourself. Wonderful, again, double exposure. This is a butterfly photo by Herbert Matter, the Bauhaus photographer and designer, in 1940. Stripes for summer beachwear in 1951. More immigrant artists that flooded over include Joseph Binder from Austria, A.M. Cassandra from France, Will Burton from Germany, Herbert Bayer and Herbert Matter, the two contemporaries, Bayer from Germany in the Bauhaus and Matter from Switzerland. Here's that Trilon and Perisphere again. This is the poster for the New York World's Fair in 1939 by Joseph Binder. He was freshly arrived on these shores, advertising the world of tomorrow. And the fact that the World's Fair was in America was a real symbol of America's coming of age, combining with the spotlights and modern transportation of subway, steamship, and I guess are those blimps at the top? America's embrace of modernism, technology, and global power. Another poster, I think, wow, this would be such a great poster for like Starbucks today. This was for iced A&P coffee. I didn't even know they drank iced coffee in 1939, but of course they did. It was cheap. This is, height of the Depression. Wonderful Cubist style. Traces of Cubism remain. 2D flat shapes and airbrushed modulations creating these strong visual contrasts and diagonal shapes. And you can kind of fill in the details of his edited naturalism here. If you didn't know, A&P was a grocery store chain about as exotic as the Acme today. Here's a cover by Will Burton, German designer for Architectural Forum, highlighting the decade from the 1930s to the 1940s, creating this interesting combination of shadows that are an integral part of the design of that's a T-square, in case you've never used one, and a triangle, which were both tools of the draftsman, the architect, and the designer, bringing this structural form and symbolic information together into a cohesive whole. The first cover of the magazine Scope by Will Burton, that was a science magazine. You've got this color illustration superimposed over a black and white photo of a test tube, signifying the new miracle drugs that were under development in the 40s, including lots of new antibiotics and the polio vaccine. The designer A.M. Cassandra, that you may remember from his wonderful Art Deco steamship posters and that Dubonnet advertisement. He came to our shores and was snapped up and commissioned to do an early ad for the Container Corporation of America. I'll talk much more about them in the future. Another ad for the Container Corporation of America from 1940. And another very abstract and modern work from 1939. This was Printers Magazine, and they did a special issue all about Herbert Bayer in 1940, a whole big article on Bayer's work and his design philosophy and ideas about typography. There's a picture of Herbert Bayer. Some of his avant-garde images. Some examples showing the Container Corporation of America ads. Some other very surrealist inspired work. And a poster to encourage egg production during the war. I saved most of the war posters for the other presentation, but just showing how these new fleeing the Bauhaus came to be put to work in the United States, advertising things like saving eggs. And by 1949, again highlighting this hopeful eye towards science, a light is beginning to dawn to solve the problem of polio. We've got this diagonal test tube visually connecting the red and blue to the bright yellow hopeful light. You can see the difference in Bayer here from his wonderful poster for Kandinsky in 1926, and then the poster supporting polio research in 1949. In between, we have, he was a 26-year-old type designer, type teacher on the left, and a 48-year-old designer on the right who's lived in a foreign land and survived a war that killed 26 million people. A lot of water under the bridge. The Container Corporation of America was a company that produced cardboard boxes, so they, in a sense, were advertising to other graphic designers. And the use of cardboard instead of metal packaging freed up other resources for the troops, and the global use of paper goods to package supplies and food for troops in harsh environmental conditions was sort of a torture test for cardboard packaging, which in the post-war boom years exploded in use. So after the war, the United States converted industry from wartime needs to consumer needs, and there was a tremendous increase in per capita income and manufacturing and growth of the middle class in the United States after World War II. This was a huge boom time in America, a housing boom, a job boom, and a manufacturing boom. And graphic design and advertising boomed, of course, too. The illustration there illustrates the growth of the suburbs as all the returning GIs and young families needed separate places to live. Part of the general move from farm to city or actually to suburb. More babies were born in the year 1946 than ever before. By 1964, there were 76.4 million baby boomers in the United States, and which made up almost 40% of the nation's population. Your parents might be baby boomers or Gen Xers. So the children of baby boomers are sometimes called echo boomers. This is the art director Otto Storch, who was named art director of McCall's magazine in 1953, and given a free hand to upgrade the graphics, typography and photography coming together as a cohesive structure. And over the course of the 1950s, we have a revolution in editorial design that occurred, and editorial design boomed along with everything else, experiencing one of its greatest eras. So we see the foundation laid for this editorial boom by all those European designers coming over, and then Otto Storch, who was born in Brooklyn, a Native American designer, and ended up working, educated at Pratt, I believe, and then tutored by Alexey Brodovitch in Brodovitch's home. His philosophy was that the idea, the copy, the art, and the type should be inseparable in editorial design. He influenced both editorial and advertising graphics. Ads, after all, ran inside of the editorial pages, in between the editorial pages of magazines. He and his photographers went to great lengths to produce unexpected and poetic photographic essays. And they often shot food and fashion on location, again, for the first time instead of in the studio. So here's a great example of this unification of image and type, the wonderful bending of the typography with the elasticity of a soft mattress underneath this sleeping woman. Some pages from McCall's wonderful, playful use of type that just becomes part of the illustration. You can see how he learned from Brodovitch that idea of the 2 pages of the spread mirroring each other. A man's life in a woman's world, a classic Otto Storch spread. Again, the idea of the visual having a concept. Wonderful fashion spread with the models retouched into this painter's box. Another page from the spread about fashion fresh as paint. And of course, in the sophisticated pages of these glamorous magazines, advertising had to fit in and stand out. And as my case study, the wonderful work from the Container Corporation of America. The Container Corporation of America was headed up by male CEO Walter Pepke. Again, this company just made cardboard boxes, so their whole idea was to promote boxes as a modern packaging solution. Their audience would have been other business leaders, and a new idea at the time was doing advertising on a sort of an intellectual level to promote the entire corporation, not just talking about the benefits of cardboard boxes. As the campaigns evolved under the leadership of Walter Pepke, with probably a great deal of influence from his wife, Elizabeth. They were patrons of design and art. They had a huge art collection and also followed the European intellectual trends of the time and became important American promoters of the Bauhaus design movement. Of course, their business, again, did deal with design. You can't do packaging without being aware of design. But they gave an enormous amount of financial support to the new Bauhaus School in Chicago that was run by the former photographer and graphic artist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, befriended many of the Bauhaus artists, and then used them to create their corporate advertising. They also hired these famous European artists and designers, the architect Walter Gropius. They helped bring Laszlo Moholy-Nagy over, and they installed the artist and designer Herbert Bayer as the town manager of Aspen, Colorado. They founded the Aspen Institute and the Aspen Music Festival, which attracted legions of writers, composers, scientists, and intellectuals to this tiny abandoned town in Colorado to share their work. Very geometric. They believed in the Bauhaus ideals of combining art and commerce, and you can see how well they invested in this idea. Total investment from their corporate headquarters. This is a building in Aspen called Aspen Meadows. They installed, again, the artist and designer Herbert Bayer as the town manager. So he had a philosophy of keeping what is old in the town, but if you build something new, build it modern. This was one of those modern buildings. And on the right installation he called the kaleidoscreen, which was these aluminum panels that rotated in the winds. And not only did they invest in physical design, but they commissioned artists they had this idea to do a tribute ad series for all of 48 states at the time. They commissioned a different artist to create a painting for each of the states. And the artists were given great freedom to interpret their ideas. It advanced this Bauhaus idea, the union of art and life, and again, hired and supported many of the ex-Bauhaus immigrants. Walter Pepke said, "I want to give people the idea that our company is a new and progressive modern operation, and I don't need a lot of text to do that. You can do it with art." They followed the state series with a series called Great Ideas of Western Man. It was one of the most brilliant institutional advertising campaigns in the history of advertising and presented the great ideas of Western culture, including themes about liberty, justice, and human rights. It ran for over 30 years with 157 different artists creating work for almost 200 ads. Collected all together, you can see how it really looks like a fine art exhibition. A few of the series together. Each page was like a mini poster. I think it's fitting for this lecture because just as they were drawing from the canon, notice the series was called The Great Ideas of Western Man. It wasn't The Great Ideas of Eastern Man or Southern Man or African Man. It was very European, white male centric, and so are the designers in this presentation. And I don't want to say that I apologize for that. I'm aware of it. And what I'm trying to do here is to reinforce or make everyone aware of the canon of graphic design, which I would say was firmly established by the designers of the Bauhaus and De Stijl, constructivist and modernist approaches in Europe, and then imported to the United States. So by linking and centering that connection between the white European male designers of the 20s in Europe with the primarily white American male or European immigrant designers of the United States in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you can see how this canon was established and perpetuated. That's not to say that there were not non-white, non-Western voices working at the time, but the general weight of commissioned art and design rested on the heads of these, fairly narrowly defined group of designers, which obviously left a lot of people out of the equation. It's also interesting how so many of these designs, I think, that speak to the conflicts and lessons of our current time, they kind of echo and reverberate down the years. So this composition by Herbert Bayer, and remember, this is 1954, after Bayer has fled from the Nazis in Europe as part of the Bauhaus. So we have this quote by Alexander Hamilton: "It is of great importance in a republic not only to guard against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of society against the injustice of the other part." Herbert Matter in 1943, the cover of Fortune magazine. Photograms in geometric shapes combined with photographs. Herbert Matter, again, the Swiss designer, wonderful experimental use of a translucent cover page that has the wrappings, the brown paper wrappings over this chair, and then the wrapped object revealed to be a person in the chair. And the chair itself is of note. Knoll Corporation, as forward-looking as the Container Corporation of America in terms of being design-centered, design-forward. Another ad for Knoll by Herbert Matter. Herbert Matter, again, much more abstract composition for Knoll. It's got the visual energy of a Alexander Calder mobile. As we move into the 40s and 50s, a number of designers were exploring scientific ideas that were especially talented at communicating these scientific and mathematical concepts to an audience that was very interested in science. Ladislav Suttner came to New York in 1939 as the design director of the Czechoslovakian pavilion of that 1939 Trilon and Paris World's Fair. This was the same year that Hitler seized his country, so he remained in New York and became a major force in the evolution of modern design in the United States. Love him. This was a book that Suttner produced in the United States called The Catalog Design Process. Made a living doing a lot of catalogs for pretty boring companies like scientific, equipment companies and again, wire manufacturing companies, people that made nuts and bolts or, bits and bobs, widgets. And in the process of doing all of these catalogs, came up with a theory of catalog design, which is hugely influential later on in the design of the World Wide Web. He explained and documented his modernist approach to designers, writers, and clients, and really created a theory of information design that was a synthesis of function, flow, and form. He had this interesting and elaborate coding system that was a system of signs and shapes that separated parts, sections, and topics with different kinds of design signals. So here he's showing all different kinds of ways of solving the upper right-hand corner as a point of entrance that contains the title. So if you were thumbing through a magazine and using the upper right-hand tab of the pages to keep track of where you were in your catalog, much the same as, again, tab navigation in the web. Another milestone in the presentation of scientific data, which took 5 years to complete by the designer Herbert Bayer, was really his sort of magnum opus of his book called The World Geographic Atlas that was produced in 1953. It was 368 pages long with 120 maps and assembled all kinds of information from multiple scientific sources. You can get them still online every now and then. I see one for sale right now that's only $2,000 if you want the original book. And you can see how gigantic the original book was. It's in this collection of the Smithsonian. This is just a spread that shows the planets in scale with respect to each other and the sun, with a photograph of a solar eruption and an illustration of a solar eclipse appearing on the right. So you've got all kinds of information being communicated in this one spread. A couple more spreads that talk about you can see on the left-hand side all kinds of isotope-related informational graphics about the population and the geography of Texas. And on the right, an exploded view of the world. And so after these European immigrants came in and sort of taught us how to do stuff, educated people, introduced these modernist ideas, systems, and theories, we have a whole new generation of American-born, primarily jazzy designers, including the photographer Art Kane. I just stuck him in here, who was, again, working with several of the editorial designers already discussed, was an American photographer, collected this wonderful group together in 1958, one of the most famous photos in jazz, because I don't have time to talk about jazz in this presentation, but jazz is an enormous influence on many visual designers of the age, a radically new musical form invented in America that combined, again, a mixture of influences, merging them all together in a uniquely American art form, and foregrounding, of course, the work of incredible African-American musicians, many of them who came from the South and ended up in Harlem as part of the Harlem Renaissance. But this New York school of designers that gained prominence in the 1950s and was a dominant force in graphic design all the way into the 1970s, with many of the designers continuing working into the 1990s. It was a shift in culture from Paris being the cultural and artistic center of the Western world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to, again, for many different reasons, huge immigration into New York City of artists and thinkers, and New York really becoming the artistic and cultural center of the Western world in the mid-20th century. Reasons for that shift from Paris to New York were the capitalistic values and attitudes of the American marketplace, encouraging competition, the fact that there was a limited artistic tradition in the U.S. before, so there was a lot of room for exploration and innovation, and the diverse ethnic heritage and mix of all different elements coming together in New York, from people moving from the rural South to the industrial North, as well as migrating from all over the world. The New York School was a merge or an expression of European design ideas that were theoretical and highly structured, with this new kind of overlay of American design ideas, a more intuitive and informal approach to organizing space. So we've got young designers like the young Paul Rand, who more than any other American designer had a thorough understanding of the modern movement, especially understanding the works of the Bauhaus artists Paul Klee, Wassily Kandinsky, and the Cubists. Here he is as an old man being used as a symbol for thinking differently by the Apple Corporation. Steve Jobs worked with Paul Rand on a logo for his next company. Again, the idea of using these contrasts of organic shape against geometric shape, photographic tone against flat color, cut and torn edges against sharp forms, handwriting versus geometric shapes, again, red against green, opposite colors, and textural patterns of type, even contrasting with the margins of the pages. He studied at Parsons in the Art Students League in New York, and by 23 years old was the art director of Esquire and Apparel Arts magazines, and became art director for Direction magazine for 8 years. This is a famous poster that Rand did for the company IBM, International Business Machines, using a rebus of I and B, and then the horizontal logo, striped logo that he invented. This is one of the covers of the magazine Direction, a Christmas cover from 1940. So it's a little bit of a shocking juxtaposition, playing with the wrapping of a present, but using barbed wire and maybe bullet holes or blood spatters instead of confetti and ribbon, a grim reminder of the spread of a global war. Another book that he authored, an extremely influential book called Thoughts on Designs. He was one of the first American graphic designers to publish this kind of theoretical approach to graphic design, including over 80 examples of his work, and it went on to inspire a generation of designers. The cover, of course, again, a photogram, that very Man Ray European photomontage idea, several exposures of an abacus placed on photosensitive paper in the darkroom. And became a metaphor of the design process of moving elements around to compose space and also to add things up. In one of the films that you're going to watch later in the semester, a contemporary designer says, "What the hell do I care about Paul Rand? Why should I learn about this guy? He's over and done. He's gone." And it's true that Paul Rand really stands as a sort of monumental figurehead of American design. So this canon kind of reinforces itself by repetition. There is an argument to destroy the canon, rip it all up, and start all over again. But it's interesting that's exactly what he was trying to do back in 1940. This is one of my favorite pieces in all of graphic design, and it's an early piece, an advertising agency, again in Philadelphia, the Weintraub Agency, pairing together the designer Paul Rand with a young writer named Bill Bernbach in 1942. The top half of all these pages were for the images, which included silhouettes, montages, and repetitions to suggest movement, and the bottom half was reserved for an unusually large amount of copy, explaining Autocar's manufacturing process. It was then included in just about every graphic design history companion or anthology that's been published since. Importantly, the pairing of an art director or a designer with a writer must have made an impression on young Bill Bernbach, because when he formed the ad agency later on, Doyle Dane Bernbach, that was the cornerstone theory of his management style, is pairing together a creative team. And I'm sure if he hadn't been paired with the genius Paul Rand, he might never have come up with that idea if his art director was a bonehead. This is a corporate ad, again, for the Westinghouse Corporation. It kind of could pass for one of those CCA ads. Westinghouse, of course, was an electric company. Rand worked for the Weintraub Agency from 1941 to 1954, and this is an ad with the headline, "Men Who Do Nothing But Think," talking about the investment of the Westinghouse Company in research and development. You've got this synergistic visual-verbal solution with handwriting, a cutout symbol, more handwriting. There's really a complicated amount of elements in there, but they're all working together in a really cohesive design. Their work together had a lot of fun with visual puns and wordplay, supported by Rand's whimsical integration of photography, drawing, and logo designs. He was instrumental in designing graphic identity for the Westinghouse Corporation and later became an independent designer more involved in trademark and corporate design than in this kind of playful full-page posters or brochure covers. He knew that the designer needed to alter and juxtapose signs and symbols to engage an audience successfully. You can see here this was a poster for the American Institute of Graphic Art, AIGA, kind of forcing you to play hide and seek with the A and the I and the G and the A, and creating a little human figure back there. He did a few film pieces and definitely was working in the same time period and venues as Saul Bass, and their work looks a little bit similar. Working on the West Coast, another native-born American designer, Alvin Lustig, he lived from 1915, sadly, only until 1955. He died young when he was 40. He was born in Colorado, but traveled between the East and West Coasts. Ended up working in architecture, graphic design, and interior design. I love this interior view of his office in California that was clearly made from galvanized aluminum sides, like an army barracks or something. He operated this small graphic design and printing business from the back of a drugstore in LA for a while, and then had his own office. And he nurtured the work of several other designers, including Ivan Shermayoff, who worked for him. Interestingly, he was colorblind always, and then as he continued working, he became totally blind, and much of his work was produced with the help of his then wife, first assistant and then wife, Elaine. Talk about her too. This is a book cover of his from 1945. New Directions Books in New York began to commission book jacket designs from him. They published books of high literary quality, so you may recognize some of the, again, the canon of writers in the names. His goal was to treat form and content as one. He definitely read these intellectual books and reflected their ideas in abstract compositions. 27 Wagons Full of Cotton and Other Plays by Tennessee Williams. We see this Southern Magnolia nailed to a barn wall with gigantic barn nails. Lustig himself had an understanding of the frail human spirit and the brutal environmental forces articulated in these plays. This is a book by Elizabeth Pollitt that he designed the book cover for, A Family Romance. I love, again, abstracting the human form using torn paper and signing his work down in the lower right-hand corner. Another Tennessee Williams book, Summer and Smoke. His wife, Elaine Lustig, who then remarried after his death at an early age and became Elaine Lustig Cohen, lived from 1927 and sadly died in 2020. She was a partner with Alvin Lustig and took over his design duties as his eyesight began to fail. Ended up marrying the publisher Arthur Cohen, who was one of their clients, and then freelance designed into the 1950s and 60s. It's interesting that men in the industry barely noticed her and never saw her as competition, as she just humbly produced dozens and dozens of spectacular book covers and other works. She also was quite an accomplished abstract painter with several shows and still worked into her 80s as both a designer and a fine artist. There she is, I think, not too long before her death. She may have been something like 87 or 88 with a little collection of whimsical elements behind her. This is a book she did about jazz in the 1950s with a foreword by Dizzy Gillespie. You can see her use of Bauhaus principles and her connection to the work of Alvin. The human meaning of the social sciences, fairly straightforward academic topic interpreted in abstract shapes. On Modern Poets. Here's some of her paintings, beautiful geometric forms using letter forms showing up. This typeface was developed with her from a single word that was used in one of her pieces, one of the last pieces that Alvin did, which Elaine worked on, was then developed into a full typeface with the help of Craig Welsh, who teaches at Hack in Harrisburg and also runs a small design company in Lancaster named Go Welsh, with the help of Nick Stover, a KUCD student who was Craig's intern at the time. They did several interviews and working sessions with Elaine in her 80s and helped to finalize her initial drawings into a full-blown typeface that was produced by the Hamilton Wood Type Company as wooden type and also released as a digital font. Another mid-century American designer, Bradbury Thompson, still living from 1911 to 1995, very influential in the 40s and 50s, developing this American modern twist on the European ideas, one of the most influential graphic designers in post-war America. Again, interestingly, working for a paper company, Westvaco Papers primarily, and he demonstrated his thorough knowledge of printing and typesetting in his work, combined with a spirit of experimentation. So you'll see a lot of references to sort of design about design and design about printing. Forum for his work was a series called Westvaco Inspirations, which was a magazine effectively done as promotion for the Westvaco paper and packaging company. Like the Container Corporation of America, Westvaco produced cardboard and paper to be used in packaging. So all of their promotional material was geared to graphic designers to encourage them to be inventive in their use of paper and packaging. So this is from Westvaco Inspirations number 210 in 1958. You can see again there the use of the color breakdown, which should be recognizable to you. This is from Westvaco Inspirations number 216, complex typography interpreting the American Civil War, which was the topic of this magazine. You've got this combination of various four-color printing plates kind of building up tone behind the large letter images. Again, using overprinting of those basic CMYK colors to achieve depth and unexpected new color combinations and interesting patterns, sometimes with multiple exposures, as here, this woman, one image of a woman with an umbrella that's moved and repeated to suggest walking, the vertical type becoming rain. Saul Bass, I mentioned before, he had a remarkable ability to reduce messages to powerful, simple photographic images and enabled viewers to interpret the content immediately. Another all-American designer, educated in New York and then moving to Los Angeles and working in the film industry in the 1950s. This is a fun billboard that he designed for Pabco Paints in the early 1950s, implying the process of painting a multicolored stripe with happy customers. A more serious topic, the movie Exodus, which was a documentary about the birth of Israel. We've got this 2D, two different levels of reality, the two-dimensional Exodus logo with the hands and raised gun with a photographically frozen moment of flames. Again, using the image that he designed as a graphic logo to introduce the film, that would have been a film canister that's wrapped up with Hebrew newspaper from Israel and the Punish headline all wrapped up. So this is a newspaper ad introducing the launch of the film. There's a movie called The Man with the Golden Arm about a heroin addict, and by the film producer and director Otto Preminger, kind of a really stark drama about addiction. And Bass this was the first comprehensive design program unifying the print and title graphics in a film. And he's still acknowledged as the master of the film title. And while we're talking about mid-century modernism, just to fully explore the idea, of course, this trend, and you can see some of those graphic ideas coming back around, and definitely the whole mid-century modernism idea trend is coming back around off of the page in terms of architecture, interior design, product design, and textile design. So let's look at a few of these artists. Probably underappreciated, I guess trendy at the time, but not really recognized as modern masters. The author, Kara Greenberg, coined the phrase mid-century modernism in 1984. She wrote a book called Mid-Century Modern Furniture of the 1950s. And in 1983, she wrote a piece for Metropolitan Home magazine about 1950s furniture. And it's hard to comprehend now just how incredibly out of style all of these works were, and then they came kind of back into style and back around. These breathtakingly groundbreaking designer couple, Charles and Ray Eames, they were American-born, him from Missouri and her from Sacramento, and met at Cranbrook Academy of Arts, again with a Bauhaus connection. Some of the Bauhaus architects and designers taught at Cranbrook. So these two definitely inherited those Bauhaus ideas. They formed their own design, furniture, and architecture office in Venice, California, in Los Angeles, right on the beach, in 1941. This is one of their buildings, the headquarters of their design office in the Pacific Palisades. an innovative construction of plywood and leftover war materials built during the war in the 1940s. And their use of plywood and other simple and inexpensive materials a direct result of the scarcity of materials in the war, and resulting in modern masterpieces like these bent plywood chairs, which again were so seen as sort of like kitschy and 1950s-ish, but then are coming back around. Another iconic design of theirs, the Ames Ottoman lounge chair, presaging things like the Aeron chair produced by Herman Miller. Their designs were picked up by the Herman Miller Company and produced for mass consumption. This puppy is still about $5,000 and is one of those design icons that's seen in every cool architect's, urban loft, as well as my own living room, I must say. Wonderful. They worked in all different kinds of mediums, including children's toys. This wonderful children's toy is called the Ames card deck, and it's each of these cards is printed with what I think of as those essential 1950s mid-century modern patterns. There's some photographs, some illustrations, found art, sort of clip arty things, and then you can build little houses and structures by slipping the cardboard cards together and using them as a building toy to inspire young designers. They also did a wonderful film called The Powers of 10, again, kind of in the heritage of this information and scientific design exploration, teaching people what the powers of 10 mean. If you get a chance, you should watch it. I'll link to it in our discussion. Another product and architect designer working during this period producing furniture for Herman Miller was the Finnish designer Eero Saarinen. And in my household, my mother, I always reference my parents, but my mother was a huge admirer of Frank Lloyd Wright and modernist contemporary designers in the 50s and 60s. We had a number of groovy period furniture experiments in our house, and she really was into Eero Saarinen. He designed the TWA terminal at JFK Airport. Again, this was the birth of the jet age and also the atomic age and the space age. So a lot of design from the mid-century modern era references these futuristic, forward-looking scenarios of like, wow, it's so cool that we live in the age of the atomic bomb and space travel and Sputnik and jet planes, all very, science fictional kind of at the time. And a British designer I'm throwing in here, again, perhaps overlooked and unappreciated during her time, except for those in the know, in the trade. Her name is Lucienne Day. It should be a household word, but it's not, but maybe it will be now. She was, a textile designer, and interestingly crossed paths at the, I think it was called the Santerbury Corporation with Carmel Snow. This is one of her textile designs. You can see this inspiration of handmade, very Bauhaus-looking illustration. This was called Calyx. This is her most famous design, created as a furnishing fabric for an interior designed by her husband, Robin Day. It was a hand screen printed on linen in lemon yellow, orangey red, and black on an olive-colored ground. It was a large-scale abstract pattern composed of cup-shaped motifs connected by spindly lines, which conjured up the aesthetic of modern painters and sculptors such as Alexander Calder and Paul Klee. And again, for people to be able to take the work of those radically modern painters, adapt it, and make it available for sort of modern American living rooms or, couches, shows the whole arc of modernism being adapted for common use. Oh, the company she worked for was Sanderson Textile Company. Did I say it was C.P. Pinellas? I'm sorry if I said the wrong person. Sanderson employed both her and C.P. Pinellas after the war as a textile designer. She also created wallpaper, ceramics, and other interiors. You can see again those wonderful spindly lines, little drawings of dandelions, and this kind of freeform organic abstraction, very back in style. Wonderful wallpaper and textile pattern there. And we can't talk about mid-century modernism without talking about this curious little subset called Googie architecture. Just love that name. And I wonder if the word Googie at all influenced the guys that named Google. I don't know. But anyway, Googie architecture is still around in Los Angeles. There's a number of these buildings that have been saved for preservation. Again, they were in style and then they were dramatically out of style and in danger of being knocked down. Everybody thought, ugh, they're so campy and trashy and kooky wacky. We got to get rid of this nonsense. So this, I believe, was a drive-in dining place called Norms. And Googie architecture, again, was inspired by these futuristic ideas of both modern designers and architects with swooping curves and geometric forms. They really look like Bauhaus works of art, I think, brought to life, or works of graphic design brought to life. And they were often for very humble businesses like gas stations and drive-in, diners. This is a gas station with this incredible flying swoop that harkens back to Eero Saarinen's TWA terminal. So the ideas of the atomic and space age sort of elements. Lots of interesting, crazy typography and signs. Anytime you see any kind of unconventional sign, also there's a lot of Googie architecture in Las Vegas, but it's kind of been overshadowed. And of course, the iconic swooping arches of McDonald's. So here's the early McDonald's with the double arches, not together in an M, but apart, lit up at night in the streets of Los Angeles. So as we opened with the Trilon and Perisphere, we're going to close this epic period of mid-century modernism in the United States in the 50s with the, I don't know, possibly hopeful image of a McDonald's at the time. And if you think of the sweep of modernism from the 1930s Depression era to 1950s boom time and the celebration of all things futuristic, scientific, and space age, pretty much sums it up. From depression to war to peacetime economic boom, American designers rose that tidal wave into the future. So toodaloo, cats and kittens, listen to some jazz and have a fun time thinking about the 50s. Bye.